About the Chicago River that we're on right now. Very grateful for this river. It is probably the #1 reason why Chicago grew as fast as it did. But right now, the river, the water in it, flows west. That's the direction that we're traveling. So it flows away from Lake Michigan. Now, if you know much about rivers, you might be a little confused because that's not what rivers do. Rivers flow into the nearest body of water, not away from it. And actually, that's what this river did for thousands of years. Until 1900, it flowed in the opposite direction, emptying into the lake. So how and why is it reversed? Well, if we go back to the beginning of the city once again, if you were here back in the 1770s all the way through the 1800s, and you were on this river, you would have been quite sick to your stomach because it would have smelled really bad. The city was using this river as its sewer and its trash dump. All the trash, all the sewage just went in the river because that's what you did back then. And that river was emptying into the lake, and that would have been bad for environmental reasons, but it was also bad for city planning reasons because the city was using Lake Michigan as their #1 source of drinking water. Yeah, really gross, right? We were poisoning ourselves with waterborne illnesses like cholera and dysentery. So in 1892, the Army Corps of Engineers came to Chicago with a plan. You might be thinking, oh, they came to clean up the river. No, they came to reverse it, so we sent our polluted water somewhere else. They dug a 28-mile channel from the south branch of the river, connecting this river to a series of rivers that empty into the Mississippi River. And by digging that channel on a downward slope, they just used gravity to permanently pull the water in the opposite direction, away from Lake Michigan, saving our drinking water, and in fact making this the only river on the planet that flows backwards. So thank you, Army Corps of Engineers, because we were about to be known as the cholera capital of the world if we didn't get that taken care of. And that's not great for your tourism campaign, so thank you, Army Corps. But we're going to hop back to some buildings now. One of my absolute favorites here on the right, this light-colored stone building with a clock tower on the roof. This is a Chicago favorite, the iconic Wrigley Building. If you've ever heard of Wrigley's Juicy Fruit or Big Red Chewing Gums or Wrigley Field where the Chicago Cubs baseball team plays, that's all the same Wrigley. William Mills Wrigley was his name. We called him the chewing gum magnate. Because of course that's how he made his millions. In fact, this building was built entirely out of chewing gum. Profits. Okay, listen, the jokes aren't going to get much better, folks, so brace yourselves. This was finished in the early 1920s, though. It was modeled after a cathedral in Sevilla, Spain called La Giralda, so we call this style of architecture Spanish Revival style. Really, really gorgeous building. Check it out after dark. It's lit up with floodlights. It's really stunning to see at night. But we're going to jump ahead from a classic like the Wrigley back in the 20s all the way to the 2000s as we take a look at the second tallest building in Chicago, right here in front of us. I bet you can't guess what this one's called. Trump International Hotel and Tower from 2009, designed by Chicago's world-famous architecture firm Skidmore, Owings & Merrill. We call them SOM for short. And this building is a really, really good example of one of my favorite styles and philosophies of architecture known as contextualism. Let me break down how that works. You'll notice 3 patio setbacks at various heights along the building, 2 on the right, 1 on the left. This first one on the right is actually at the same height as the roof of the Wrigley that we just talked about. That one on the left, same height as the roof of that domed building across the river, the Jewelers Building. And that one all the way up on the right, same height as the roof of the boxy black building coming into view behind it. And so contextualism is a form of site-specific design, where you design a building to be in relationship with the area that surrounds it. And the cool thing is that could be anything nearby, natural or man-made, the river, the sky, trees, other buildings, anything. Lead architect on Trump Tower is a man named Adrian Smith, very famous architect. And he's often called the world's tallest architect. He's only 5'7". So my students would call him a medium-sized king. But he did design most of the world's tallest buildings, which is how he got that nickname. So Adrian Smith, that name will pop up later on in the tour. See if you can remember it. I warned you, I'm a teacher. Going for comprehension and retention, folks. Coming into view on our right, 2 of the most photographed structures in the entire city. We have the twin corncob towers of Marina City. Now, Marina City was designed and built in the 1960s by architect and visionary social scientist Bertrand Goldberg. And I told you about that river, right? It was really polluted. Even though we reversed it, we didn't stop polluting it. So in the 60s, when Marina City was built, the river smelled bad. It was gross. No one lived down here. It was industrial and commercial. But Goldberg wanted to change that. He wanted people to live downtown. Here's the thing. There was no support for that. No entertainment, nowhere to wash your clothes, no restaurants. So he had to put it all in his building. And he designed the country's first mixed-use residential skyscraper complex, a city within a city. So let's imagine for a moment it's the 1960s, you want to move into Marina City. This is what you're going to get. First, you'll move in upstairs where you have to, yes, furnish a pie-slice shaped apartment, which is kind of tough. But then you're going to live above a valet parked car, your parked yacht, because who doesn't have a yacht, restaurant, movie theater, bowling alley, shops, office space, fitness center, laundry facility, and an ice skating rink. City within a city. And I know some of you are thinking to yourselves, I wonder if anyone's ever driven a car off one of those balconies in the river. Well, the answer is, this is America. Of course we did. It was in the movie The Hunter. Steve McQueen drove a car off one of those balconies into the river. It was an iconic action scene. You can look it up on YouTube. But folks, Marina City was so successful that Goldberg actually began to change our attitude towards the river. We began to embrace it. We continued to build alongside it, and most importantly, we cleaned it up. And by 2016, we sealed the deal when we finished our incredible Riverwalk. Now, this Riverwalk here on the left is 1.3 miles long. It travels along the length of the main branch. It did cost $112 million, but I think it was worth every penny. I highly recommend exploring the Riverwalk while you're here in the city. The architect of the Riverwalk, her name is Carol Ross Barney, and she designed each section to have its own distinct purpose and personality. This section to our left is my favorite. She calls this the River Theater. Now, for a long time, I didn't know why she called it that, until last summer I took my dog out there. We sat there for a couple hours and I realized, oh, the river is the show. Tour boats, party boats, kayaks, yachts, and now we even have hot tub boats that you can see floating down the river. People were floating in hot tubs on the river in January in Chicago, because that's how we roll. But listen, folks, this Riverwalk is a gift. It's a public amenity. It's free to anyone who lives in the city or visits, and there's restaurants, shops, bars, all kinds of action happening on the Riverwalk. So I highly encourage you to take advantage of this public amenity while you're in town. See the city from a little bit different of a perspective. Now you can actually see, one of our L trains right in front of us on the elevated track. That's where the name comes from, L, elevated. So the L actually runs in a loop around this downtown city center, so that's what we call this neighborhood to our left. And I highly recommend, be bold, be brave. Ride on the train, folks. It's the cheapest way to get around town. $5 for a 24-hour day pass gets you unlimited trips on the bus and the train. That's how I get to work every day. But we got to switch gears, and we're going to go and talk about the first major national style of architecture here in the U.S. with this building coming up on the right. This building is huge. It occupies 2.5 city blocks. It has 43 elevators, 7.5 miles of hallway, 73 American-sized football fields of office space. Until 2008, this building had its own zip code. This, from 1929, is the massive Merchandise Mart. And it's the first example of our first major national style of architecture in the U.S. Like I said, this is called Art Deco. And let me point out the most common features of the Art Deco style that you can see displayed beautifully here. First, you got those inset windows, and those create the iconic vertical racing stripes you see on Art Deco buildings. Then it's covered in machine-stamped repetitive patterns and polished limestone. So again, this was 1929. That was what we called the Roaring 20s here in the U.S. That was the peak of the decade, of course. In the United States, you know, we were really full of ourselves. It was a period of optimism, opulence, luxury. Everyone here in 1929 was like, woo, we're rich, nothing bad will ever happen to us. Definitely not later this year. So this style was intended to express that optimism. Were you going to ask about the heads? Yes, the sculpture heads. Those are called the Merchant Princes of Chicago, all the big retail guys who helped pay for Chicago, the cheapest baby. But right now, folks, we are at Wolf Point. Soak it in. We call this the trophy case of the Chicago River. Not hard to see why, right? Especially on a sunny day like today. Look, I've been giving this tour for 4 years now, and my breath was just taken away a little bit coming in here. I absolutely love this view. What a stunning example of the most modern architecture we have here in the city. Sleek, futuristic buildings, blue glass, reflective surfaces. The Salesforce Tower to the right, just finished last year. That's the newest building on the tour. Got some buildings with really unique shapes. This curvy one to the left we'll talk about later. How about that one up ahead behind the Lake Street Bridge with a narrow base? Looks like it's going to blow over. We're definitely going to talk about that in a few minutes. And we even have skyscrapers that look like giant sticks of deodorant, or Hot Pockets, or McDonald's cherry pie boxes. Right? People have their own opinion on which they think it looks more like, but you know, this is a testament to the technology that we've developed because we can manipulate these materials in new and interesting ways. But enough about all this new stuff, because I want to take you back to 1898 to talk about the oldest building that we're going to see on our tour today. And I'm talking about this really exciting pink brick box up ahead on the left. I know it's a little unremarkable, but it does have a great story. So this is the historic Fulton House. Of course, built back in 1898 as a cold storage freezer building for the meat packing industry. Now, Chicago was the meat packing capital of the world for much of the 1800s and 1900s. And that's because we had what was called the Union Stockyards. Those were slaughterhouses on the South Branch, and we processed a ton of meat. But of course, before that meat was shipped out, it had to be stored in a cold space somewhere. So we had a lot of these freezer buildings downtown. Here's where it gets interesting though. This building here, the Fulton House. So in the 70s, the early 70s, that meatpacking business shut down. And they moved out of the building. That's because the stockyards had closed and we were no longer exporting as much of that meat as we had. So it closed down, and when the builders got inside to renovate it for the new owners, it took them over 3 months to thaw out the building because they cut through the walls that they discovered were 4 feet thick, and what they found was cork and matted horsehair, which was a very early version of insulation before styrofoam was invented. And judging by the looks on some of your faces, I should reassure you, you cannot ask for a horsehair at Home Depot anymore, so we don't put that in our buildings. Only building on the tour that isn't vegan. But in the 70s, the windows and balconies were cut into the building and it was converted into a residential structure. So now you can find condos and apartments in the Fulton House today. It's actually one of the cheaper places to rent an apartment here downtown, but very historic. Though it doesn't get much more historic than the raised bridge to the right across from the Fulton House. That is the Carroll Avenue Railroad Bridge, built in 1908. It was decommissioned in 2001 because they didn't need the train tracks that crossed it anymore. And so it's been converted into a Chicago landmark. That means you can't tear it down unless you want to fill out a ton of paperwork. But it's a really good example of the way that our bridges operate. You see that chunk of concrete on the right? That's called the counterweight. That's how much weight you need to lift that massive steel structure in the air. And it really does look pretty cool when you're coming by it here on the boat. But we're gonna hop back over to the left. And the guy who renovated this building, the Fulton House, Harry Weiss, the next building just past it is his as well. This is the River Cottages, 4 very unique townhomes from 1988, designed by that architect, Harry Weiss. It's a really good example of postmodernism. Postmodernism is a style of architecture that you can kind of think of as like the abstract art of architecture. Whimsical, unique. These buildings always kind of tell a story. And the story this building is telling us is that Harry Weiss really loved sailboats. You can see the round porthole windows, and you can see all those triangles, right? Kind of like a sail on a sailboat.